You may know Astro as a framework for just static content, but it can actually do everything on the server that you might expect from other frameworks like Next.js. So in this video, let's see how to create this dynamic emoji reaction component that uses Svelte, Astro Islands, and API endpoints. So a couple things to note as we work through this demo. We're using Astro Islands and specifically using the UI framework of Svelte. So this project is already set up with Svelte incorporated, but if you were starting from scratch, you could run the npx astro add svelte command, and that will add support from Svelte. So inside of our Astro config, you can see this is set up because it references Svelte function inside of here that comes from that package inside of the integrations. So this gives us full ability to create Svelte components and reference them inside of Astro. So here's a starter Svelte component that we're going to work with. It imports a few things and then basically just displays a dummy button right now that says I'm an emoji that we need to go and update and then handle the emoji reactions, etc. Now you'll see there's a couple of TypeScript types in here, and I think these are helpful to kind of give structure to all this work. So inside of our emoji types, we have a couple of different things. We have an emoji enum, which is basically a list of all the different emojis that we're going to work with, their names. This is so that we can specifically only work with these emojis and not let you, the developer, me, the developer, type something that doesn't fit. Then we'll have a reaction detail. Now for each one of these reactions, we need to keep track of whether or not the user who's logged in has already reacted to this thing and then the count of that reaction. And then for our overall reaction details, we need to keep up with all of that information associated with each emoji. So you can see here reaction details has a key on the left of the emoji and then a value of the reaction details. So that's the thing that we're going to query from the database and then be able to pass down to our components to then be able to display. Lastly, we export the emoji list, which is the values from the enum up here, basically just an array of all those emoji names. Now in this video, we're going to start with a bunch of starter code from the full demo that comes from my full Astro course. So if you're interested in following along and building this entirely from scratch, you can check out the full Astro course at astrocourse.dev, which will be completely updated for Astro 4.0 to teach you the latest and greatest with Astro. So check that out at astrocourse.dev. Otherwise, you can just follow along here. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's go ahead and start to display something closer looking to an emoji. Now inside of here, I want to import an icon from our icon package. So we can start by importing thumbs up, and this is going to come from the Fort Awesome free solid SVG icons package. Now again, this is already installed, and then I also already have the FA component from the Svelte FA package. So if we go and just search for this Svelte FA, you can see all the docs to get started on this on npm. Basically, you need the Svelte FA component to be able to use a Svelte component, but then you need the specific icon that you're referencing, in this case, coming from free solid SVG icons. So that's what we're going to use to be able to display our emojis. Now to display this, we can reference inside of our button the FA component, and then we can pass in the specific icon that we want to work with. So we can say the icon is going to be the thumbs up icon, the FA thumbs up. And then we'll close out this. So now we basically just have an individual icon that's displayed, not much really working more than that, but let's just go ahead and see that this displays correctly. So inside of our locally running application, if we scroll back up, we should see that we have this little emoji right here, which doesn't do a whole lot, but it is there. Now the key thing is we want to actually display 4 of these things. So we want to import the thumbs up, the heart, the rocket, and the star. Now from here, we could just replicate each one of these and each one refer to a different icon. This is not ideal, but we could do this and reference each one individually. This will work, but there's a much better way to do this, especially if we were to add more emojis later on. So instead of hard coding each one of these, what we can do is reference that emoji list that we have inside of our types. So if we go back to types, we have our emoji list, which is basically just all the values from the enum up here. We can iterate through those and then be able to display the emoji. So inside of Svelte, if we want to do an iteration, we do this inside of an each block. And then we reference the thing that we want to iterate through, emoji list. And then what do we want to call the individual thing as we're iterating through? And we'll call that emoji. Now we can close this out with a closing each tag, and then we can give this a little space. And I don't know if we imported our emoji list, and I think we imported this incorrectly as a type. So this will need to be imported like this. So specifically the reaction details is a type and then emoji list is not. So we import the emoji list, we iterate through each one, and then how do we actually choose which one of these icons to display? Well, instead of hard coding this obviously to FA thumbs up, what I want to do is create a dynamic relationship between the name of the emoji and the actual icon that we imported. So for this, I'm going to declare and just paste in an object here called name to icon. This gives us the relationship between the name on the left and the icon that we want to display on the right. So instead of hard coding this to FA thumbs up, we can reference our name to icon map or object, and then we can pass it in the key of the current emoji that we're on. Now we should be able to see that all of these are still being correctly displayed, even though we only wrote one individual version of this, but we're iterating through it dynamically, which saves us a lot of time in code. Now there's some styles that are missing in here, so I'm going to paste in some styles to this button so this will look a little bit better individually. So we've got some basic styles to give this a width, to spread out the items inside of this. We still have a count to be able to add inside of this as well, and then give it a gray color. And that looks okay, but we want these to be displayed horizontally instead of vertically. So for this, I'm going to wrap all of these in a div container, and then we're going to make this div a flex box. So we're going to say this is of display flex. Then we'll do a gap X of 2, which will put space between these horizontally. Then we'll align everything center both vertically and horizontally. And then we'll go ahead and give this a specific height of H8. So you can see these are now spread out and those look okay. The next thing that we want to do though is add some additional classes for whether or not this thing has actually been selected by the user. So if we were to just add all of these classes in there, we'll add these dynamically in a minute. This is what it would look like. So we change the text color, we give it the border, we give it the background, etc. Now, the other thing we need to display is a count inside of here. So right now we're just displaying the icon, but we also need to display the count with a span, not a spans. And this could be 1, for example. And then we want to mark this with a class of text small. Now, ideally, the two things we want to do is that this count information should be dynamic based on what's actually in the database. And then also only these classes will be applied if this is an emoji reaction that the user has already reacted to. So we'll talk about updating that in a second. We're just getting all the pieces in the right spot. So we're able to display each of these and they have the associated counts with them appropriately, which is great. So now let's try to work with some more realistic data. And I'm going to update this class description to be dynamic based on a reacted property. So I'm going to update and just kind of override these classes. And what you'll see is we're using this Boolean of reacted to be able to add these classes or not. We'll add that back in a second. And then we're going to reference a variable inside of here for count. Now, both of these reacted and count are not defined yet. So where do those come from? Well, those are going to come from the reaction details that get passed into this component. So reaction details has a key for each one of our emojis, and then the details, which is a count and a reacted Boolean for each one. So we need to actually pass in some of those details into this component and then be able to reference them. So where does this reacted property come from? Well, this is going to come from the reactions details that we get passed into this component. And then it's going to be from the key of the emoji that we're at and then the reacted property. Let's make sure that that is spelled correctly. And then the same thing down here for count. So we're able to just kind of display these things. Now we're going to reference them from real data that gets passed into this component. Now the problem is we're not actually passing this data into the component yet. So we need to go back to where we're referencing this component and update it. So this is inside of the dynamic page for each individual blog post, and we're trying to display this here, but we're missing that property. So at some point, what we'll need to do is create a variable for reaction details, and this will be of type reactions details, and we'll create this as an empty object to start. We want to make sure we get this import. And now inside of here, we need to make sure that we reference each of those different emojis. So we can have our rocket, then we can have our star, our heart, and our thumbs up. Now I'm going to use multiple cursors in here to assign an object to these keys. So the value of this will be a count of 0 and then reacted of false by default. And then we'll add our commas, and now this should be okay. And I think this U should be lowercase. So now we have our reaction details that we can pass into this component. And instead of saying something like this, if we save this and get automatic formatting, inside of Svelte, you can actually just do a shorthand, which will surround this in brackets to start. So it'll look like this. And I think there's one additional property that we need to pass into this, and that is the post that we're currently working on. And in this specific example that I'm working on, this post property is going to come from the post data that we queried, and then from the slug property. So that should be okay there. And then we should be able to come back and see that all of these have 0 reactions and then have not been reacted to by the user. Now we could update this to say true, and then 1, for example, and true here, and set this to 5 total reactions or something. And we should see that now those are being displayed correctly, which is good. Now, one thing I want to do is actually not display this number if it's not actually greater than 0. So we can go back and add some conditional logic to this piece of text here. So we can use an if condition inside of Svelte, which has the hashtag if, and then our condition, which is if the count is greater than 0. And this is actually going to come from this object. So let's go ahead and paste this in. So if the count for that specific emoji is greater than 0, we'll display it. Otherwise, we just skip it. So now we should see that those zeros go away, and this is starting to look a little bit more realistic. But we don't actually have any real functionality. What we need to do is actually create an API endpoint where we can handle emoji reactions on the server and update those in the database. Now for our database, I'm personally using Xata, which I like for a lot of different reasons. It comes with a visual editor to create and edit and view your data, which is really nice. You'll see that in a second. It also comes with TypeScript types that it generates using its CLI so that you can have TypeScript types for all of your data as well. There's a few other things that are really, really nice, but those are the core things. So if you wanted to follow along with this, you could create a table in Xata for free, create a free account, create a table. And then inside of mine, it looks like this. So I have a few different tables for this whole demo, one for comments, for reactions, subscribers, users, etc. But in this case, I'm focused on reactions. And in this case specifically, we have a reference to the user that is doing the reacting. That way we can check whether or not a given user has given a specific emoji per blog post. And then we also keep a reference to the blog post name as well as the actual emoji. So this reactions table is a relationship between the user, a specific emoji, and a specific blog post. So those are the pieces of information that are given to us. Now I mentioned that this comes with TypeScript types. So if you run a Xata init and connect to this table, it will generate code for you. So if we look down inside of reactions, you can see here's the TypeScript definition that it generates for us that we can then reference in our code, which again kind of brings this all together. Also, if you're wanting to learn more about this all put together and built from scratch, you can check out the Astro course at astrocourse.dev and be able to build all of this from the ground up to make sure you didn't miss anything. So that's kind of the database piece. Let's go ahead and start with our API. Now I already have an API directory inside of my pages directory, and then I have a react.ts file inside of here. So I've got some starter code. So basically what we do is define a post endpoint, and we're using TypeScript. So we define it as post, define it as an API route, etc. And then I do some checks to see if the user is logged in. So I don't want to handle any emoji reactions if the user is not logged in. Now, if you want to understand fully how we're tracking authentication here, you'll have to take the course. But in this case, I'm just referencing this user ID that's stored in cookies. If the user is not logged in, we redirect them, or actually we just respond back with a 401. From there, we want to check to see if the two properties that we expect inside of the body of this request are there, and that's the post and the emoji. And again, there's 3 different things that we need to know: who the user is, or the user ID, which post they're reacting to, and which emoji they're reacting with. So if either of these 2 properties is not passed in, we return back a 400 bad request, and then we can move on to our real logic. Now inside of here, the first thing I do is create a reference to the Xata client. Now from here, we need to check to see if the user's reaction for a specific emoji for a specific blog post already exists. If it does, we delete that and then respond back. Otherwise, we create that reaction. This way we can be completely sure that their user can only react one time for a blog post with a given reaction. So the first thing we'll do inside of here is check for an existing record. So we'll say existing record, and then we'll reference our Xata client and then reference DB. And then notice I get IntelliSense here for the different tables that I can access. Now from here, I'll call a filter, and we want to filter based on those properties that we just mentioned. So the post and the emoji, and then a specific relationship for the user. So inside of our React table, we have a reference to a user that is in a different table, and we want to reference that table's ID property. So we can do this with the dot notation inside of here. And then we'll reference the user.value, and that comes from what we got out of the cookie. So if we look back at the top, we get a user from the cookies, and then we can reference its value as the user ID. Now, if there is an existing record, what we want to do is simply just delete that record. So we can await existing record dot delete. And I think we missed one line on here, which is to make sure we're only getting one element inside of this query. That way we're actually able to reference this delete function. Now, if there's not a reaction, we need to create that thing. So we'll create a variable called created record, and this will reference our client again, db dot, and then reactions. And then we'll call create. And then similar to what we just queried on, we'll pass in the properties that we want to create with. So our post, our emoji, and then our user will be the value from the cookie that we just referenced. This will set up that relationship between the user inside of the reaction record and the actual user from the user table. Now, in either one of these cases, we can respond back with a successful status. So in the first case, we'll respond back with the existing record and a status of 200. On the second case, we'll respond back with a status of 200 and the created record that we just created. And I'm renaming this from reaction to record. All right, then we have some basic error handling down here, nothing too specific. So from here, we could go into something like Postman. I use the Postman extension in VS Code and send this request directly inside of Postman and attach those properties. But I say we go ahead and test this from the front end. So from our front end, what we need to do is actually make the fetch request to that back end and then be able to update the data that's displayed on the screen based on that reaction taking place. So we are going to define a fetch request, and we'll put this inside of a try catch. And then inside of this, we will get our response. And this is going to come from our fetch request. And we're going to send this to the endpoint at API/React. And then we can define the config object for this request. So we'll define the method as post. Then we'll define the body, which is going to be a stringified version of an object that has the emoji and the post inside of it. Now see here that our emoji is not referenced, and that's because we need to pass it into this function. All right, so then we'll create that request with this configuration, and then we'll need to check the status that comes back. So if it's an OK status, we know that it worked, and we now need to update the data that displays on the screen. So we can check to see if the reaction details for this specific emoji has already been reacted. We can then update that to be not reacted. So we can set that to be false, and then we can update the reaction details for the given emoji, the count property, to be itself -1. So we're just going to decrease that thing. Otherwise, we'll do the complete opposite of this. So we can copy down these details, and we'll say that that reacted property is now true and that our count has increased by 1. So if we are able to get a successful response back, we check to see if the data that we already have, if it says that the user has already reacted to this thing, we now say they haven't reacted, and then we decrement that count. Otherwise, we say they have reacted successfully and we add to that count. Now we can also add a check in here for else if the res.status equals 401. So if we get an unauthenticated request, we can redirect the user to the login page by setting the location href to /login. And then if we have any errors, we could do more than this, but for now, we'll just log out these errors. Now for our onClick handler, we need to update this just a tiny bit to define this as kind of an inline function that then calls this emoji reaction and passes in that emoji. That way this function up here will have all the context that it needs to make the request to the backend API endpoint and then display the UI appropriately. Now, if we were to go over and test to see if this is working, we'll see that nothing actually happens. And even if we go in and inspect and look in the network, we'll still see that nothing at all is happening. And this is the one big gotcha that comes with using Astro Islands. And that is that you need to annotate each time you want to reference one of those with a client directive if you want to bring in JavaScript. Now, the one that I'm going to use in this case is the visible, which only is going to load this JavaScript when that component becomes visible on the page. So let's go back and let's actually look at when we load JavaScript. So if we start at the top of this, it is already loading the Svelte JavaScript here, and that's because this is close enough to the top of the page. If we were to move this though, let's say to the bottom after the actual post. So if we were to move this to the bottom of the page and we start at the top and refresh, notice there's no Svelte that's loaded inside of here, no Svelte. Then when we scroll down to the bottom of this and get close to those reactions, we should see that it makes that Svelte request. Now this is really nice because with Astro Islands, we can specifically choose when and where and how we want that JavaScript to be loaded. So I'll just move this back. And since this is going to be loaded at the top of the page anyway, we could use this as client visible, or we could just say client load, which will load this every time and give us that JavaScript that we need. So you see, if we click one of these, it should go away, and then it should come back if we then update again. So this should work for each one of these, and that is successfully making that request to the backend. If we look in our fetch request, you can see it's making a request to that backend API endpoint. Now this data should be reflected inside of our database. If we look inside of here, we have a few different reactions that have been created. Now our next challenge though is to be able to go and query this information so it accurately reflects what's really there. Because if we refresh this, we still see that dummy data and not the real data. So let's go back to our code and I'll show you the code that actually does these queries. So I've got a couple of different utility functions in here that will do the majority of this work for us. So I've got a couple of functions in here that will actually do that work for us. Now this is pretty Xata specific, so I didn't want to walk through doing all this from scratch, although you can get that in the course, but I'll show you what's there and show you how we use aggregates to get counts for each individual emoji, and then check whether or not the user has reacted to it. So we first have our get reaction counts by post. So for each post, we want to get how many times each reaction has been reacted. So we get a reference to our Xata client, and then we want to create an aggregate config object, which gets passed into this aggregate function to be able to query per emoji the count for each one. So we give this a key of the individual emoji that we're working on, and then we set the value to be the thing that we're actually querying, which is an object that says we want to do a count, and then we want to filter based on the emoji and the post. So how many times has this individual blog post been reacted with a given emoji? Now this is using reduce to be able to convert this to that aggregate object. And then we pass that into the aggregate function, which then responds back to us with args. And that's the actual relationship, what we want, where we have our keys on the left and then the counts on the right. Now from here, we also need to find out, has the user reacted to each one of these? So we first get a new instance of our client. We then get our reaction counts from the function that we just created. And then we want to get the reactions by the user. So for a given user ID, give me all of the reactions for that post that they have reacted to. Then we basically just merge all of this information into an object of type reactions details. So remember, reactions details, if we look at this data, is a key on the left side for each one of our emojis, and then the details are the count and then the reacted Boolean property. So we get all of this information and return it. So now inside of our slug, instead of just hard coding this data, we can call our get reactions details by post function, and then we'll need to import this so we can get the missing import for this. All right, and then we're missing our two different properties, and that is the slug and the user. So if we look back up at the top, we actually have the slug in our params. And then the other thing we want is the user, and we can get this from our astro.cookies.get, and then we want to get the user ID. So that should get those details, and then we can pass those right in. So we pass in the slug and then the user, and this should get us all the details that we need after we await this request. So it's going to respond back with those details. And this is saying that the slug could be undefined, which is okay. In this case, it will be because we're going to the right pages. So if we now go reload our page and kind of start from scratch, we can hit the heart reaction. If we come back into our database, we see that shows up. We can hit the rocket ship. That should show up as well. And then the same logic, if we were to remove these, we can see that this deletes the rocket and then we delete the heart. And then this data is persisted across page refreshes as well. So we refresh the page, we see that this information is still there. So that is how you can create a dynamic reaction component inside of Astro by using a framework like Svelte and connecting to API endpoints and a Xata database. Now, if you're interested in how to build all of this stuff from scratch, including all the other features in this example, you can go to astrocourse.dev to check out the full course, which will teach you everything you need to know about Astro. Now, it's also being updated for Astro 4.0, so this will be updated shortly as well, and you'll be able to take advantage of all the latest and greatest features in Astro, which is pretty incredible. So check it out at astrocourse.dev. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you next time.